The year was 1874, and spring had only begun to whisper across the high ridges where snow still clung to the slopes like stubborn sorrow. Derek Holt rose before the sun, as he always did, the mountain air sharp against his face, the axe in his hand as familiar as the scar across his knuckle. He split logs by the stack outside his cabin, each strike echoing against the hollow valley. The cabin stood alone in a clearing of tall pines, smoke curling from its chimney, a place of silence that seemed carved out for a man with too few words and too many ghosts. His widowed mother stirred within, slow in her age, while Derek worked with the ache of someone who had long ago accepted loneliness as his truest companion. For 3 winters since his wife's passing, he had lived by the rhythm of wood, water, and silence. Sometimes, when dawn glowed over the peaks, he swore he could still hear her voice calling him inside, though he knew it was only memory tangled in the morning wind. The ache had dulled, but never left. Grief was no longer a scream. It was a low hum beneath every action, every breath. He filled the emptiness with labor, keeping his hands busy and his mind quiet. By mid-morning, Derek carried the fresh-chopped logs inside. His mother, Martha, sat at the hearth, stirring a pot of thin stew. Her eyes, though clouded by years, were still sharp enough to read her son's silence. "The mountains won't keep you warm forever," she said softly, not looking at him. "A man's heart needs more than wood and stone." Derek set the logs down and answered with a shrug, as if her words were wind brushing past his ear. He had learned to guard his grief the way a bear guards its den. That afternoon, clouds pulled across the peaks, shadows trailing down the valley. Derek led his mule to water when he caught it, the faint sound of hooves that did not belong to him. His hand went instinctively to the worn handle of the hatchet at his belt. Strangers rarely found their way this far into the mountains unless trouble rode with them. Out of the trees came 2 figures on a weary mule, its ribs showing through its hide. The women riding it looked as if the earth itself had worn them down. The elder, not by much, sat straight despite the fatigue in her frame, her dark hair wind-blown, her dress patched at the elbows, her face both beautiful and haunted. The younger clung behind her, pale and trembling, eyes darting as though the world had turned against her. They reined in near the clearing, hesitant. Derek stood tall, his broad frame backlit by the thinning sun, saying nothing until the mule snorted and stopped. The elder woman raised her chin, her voice quiet but steady. "Sir, we've no place else to go. Might you spare us a corner of shelter, even for a night?" The younger one added, barely more than a whisper, "Please." Derek studied them with the stillness of a man who measured everything before speaking. He could see the dust of long travel on their hems, the way the elder tried to hide the tear in her sleeve, the way the younger's hands clutched her sister's waist, as if letting go would mean falling into ruin. He should have sent them back down the valley. He knew how tongues wagged in town, how quickly judgment spread about a widower taking in stray women. Yet there was something in the elder's eyes. Not pleading, not pride, but a quiet endurance that struck a chord inside him. "My name's Derek Holt," he said at last, voice rough from disuse. "This is my land. Who are you?" "Dellie Mae Carter," the elder answered, touching her sister's arm. "This is Hattie." Derek nodded once. "Where's your home?" Dellie's jaw tightened. "Cast out of it. Our stepfather said we were burdens not worth the roof." The words carried no tears, only the steady tone of someone who had endured too much cruelty to waste breath on begging. For a moment, silence hung heavy, only the mule shifting its weight. Derek felt his mother's gaze from the cabin window. He could almost hear the gossip that would rise in town. The widowers taken in 2 poor girls. Shame curled at the edges of his mind, but so did memory. The way he once found his own wife crying by the river because her kin had shunned her. The echo was too sharp to ignore. "Come down," he said finally. "The mule needs rest, and you look like you do too." Inside the cabin, Martha's eyes widened when the women entered, but she said nothing unkind. Dellie bowed her head in thanks, though her pride kept her back straight. Hattie followed like a shadow, clutching the edge of her sister's dress. Derek ladled stew into tin bowls, setting them before the sisters. He noticed Deli's hands tremble, yet she forced herself to eat slowly, with dignity, as though she feared being seen as desperate. Hattie, younger and less guarded, whispered a soft, "Thank you, sir." Deli met Derek's gaze briefly across the firelight. Her eyes held both caution and unspoken relief. Derek felt something stir in him, a faint warmth, like a spark beneath ash. He looked away, busying his hands with the kettle. That night, Derek laid out spare blankets by the hearth. Deli's voice was quiet as she accepted them, but he caught the faint hitch in her breath, the trace of shame hidden beneath gratitude. He said nothing, only nodded. Gestures spoke better than words. Long after the fire had burned down to embers, Derek lay awake on his bed of pine boards. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the smell of thawing earth. From across the cabin came the hushed sound of Deli's whisper. "Maybe, Hattie," she murmured, her voice barely more than a breath. "We've found a place where no one will throw us out." The younger sister stirred, sighing into her blanket. Derek closed his eyes, the words carving into him like the edge of the axe he wielded that morning. His mother's earlier warning returned, though now it sounded less like a reproach and more like a prophecy. A man's heart did need more than wood and stone. In the quiet, Derek realized his life of silence had shifted in a single day. He did not know yet if it would be for better or worse, but he could not deny that something had entered his home that felt larger than pity, deeper than chance. He turned to face the ceiling beams, rough-hewn and dark with smoke, listening to the faint breaths of the sisters by the hearth. The mountains outside stood eternal, but inside his cabin, change had already taken root. And as sleep pulled at him, he knew with a certainty as sharp as the cold night air that the world beyond gossip and grief had found its way back to his door, and would demand a reckoning he could not avoid. Spring deepened in the valley, the snow retreating higher into the crags, and with it came the slow murmur of gossip carried down from town. Derek Holt had known it would come the moment he opened his door to the two women, but knowing did not soften the sting. At the general store, while he measured out flour into a sack, voices trailed behind him. Two women under his roof, one muttered, her bonnet bobbing as she leaned toward another. "He's been alone too long." The words crawled beneath his skin like burrs. Derek kept his jaw tight, offered no reply, and lifted the sack onto his shoulder with the silence of a man accustomed to carrying weight. Yet when he stepped outside into the bright air, the shame followed him like a shadow. Back at the cabin, he found Deli by the fire, mending a tear in his work shirt with stitches so small and patient they seemed almost invisible. She did not look up as he entered, yet the quiet dignity of her act disarmed him more than any words. Hattie hummed softly as she swept the floor, her presence lighter, almost childlike in its eagerness to please. His mother sat in her rocker, watching, eyes narrowed not with suspicion, but with a keen appraisal of age. "They're useful," she said when Derek passed, setting down the flour. "But more than that, they're steady. A woman who mends a man's shirt without being asked. She's saying something she won't put into words." Derek's ears burned, though he gave no answer. Each day brought small moments like that, each one gnawing at the walls he had built around himself. Deli at the wash basin, sleeves rolled up, humming low as the water darkened with soot. Deli teaching Hattie how to knead bread with what little flour they had, laughter spilling from her lips unguarded. Her face suddenly lit with a warmth that startled him. Derek would catch himself staring too long, feeling something stir that he had long believed buried with his wife. He turned away quickly, splitting wood or mending fence, but the warmth lingered. The gossip grew louder with each trip to town. Men muttered about his judgment. Women shook their heads in quiet disapproval. Some whispered he had taken Deli as his mistress already. Others claimed she had bewitched him. Deli seemed aware of it, though she never asked. She carried herself with quiet resilience, as if shame were a cloak she had worn so long it no longer fit heavy on her shoulders. But Derek could see the flicker in her eyes when townsfolk fell silent upon her passing. It was during one of those errands that the storm came. Clouds rolled down the mountains like dark armies, and the wind tore through the trees with a howl that set the horses restless. Derek pushed hard to get home, rain slashing his face, thunder shaking the earth. By the time he reached the cabin, lightning cracked so close it rattled the ground. Inside, Deli had gathered blankets around Martha, her hair damp from running to close the shutters, Hattie clutching her arm with wide eyes. Derek felt a sudden swell of gratitude, seeing how instinctively Deli moved to protect what was his. The storm raged into the night, the chimney groaning under the force of the wind. Then came the smell, sharp and bitter, the hiss of sparks catching where rain could not reach. Flames lit the roof timbers before anyone could shout. Hattie screamed, Martha coughed, and panic split the room. Derek grabbed the bucket, shouting for Deli to take his mother. Without hesitation, Deli plunged into the smoke, wrapping her arms around Martha, guiding her through the doorway as sparks fell around them. Derek dashed back and forth from the water barrel, dousing flames, while Hattie stumbled behind with a smaller pail, her arms shaking but determined. The townsfolk arrived, drawn by the light of fire against the storm-dark sky. Some came to help, others only to watch, whispers rising even over the roar of wind. Derek heard them, but paid no mind. He saw only Deli, her face blackened with soot, her eyes fierce as she shoved a blanket into the gap of the doorframe to choke the flames. Together, they fought the fire as if the cabin were the last thing holding them to the world. Buckets passed from hand to hand, sweat mingled with rain, and slowly the fire relented, beaten down to smoldering ash. When dawn came, the cabin stood scarred but still standing, smoke curling in thin ribbons into the pale sky. Derek leaned against the fence post, chest heaving, clothes soaked through. Beside him, Deli stood with her hair plastered to her face, soot smeared across her cheek, but she held her chin high. For the first time, Derek reached for her hand, rough palm against soot-streaked skin, a gesture not loud but steady, a vow in silence. The townsfolk, those same who had whispered, now watched without a word. In the smoke and ash, judgment had burned away. Days later, when the mountains glistened with new green and the church bell tolled across the valley, Derek stood at the front of the small wooden chapel. He wore his best coat, though it bore patches, and his hands were steady as Deli walked toward him, her dress simple but clean, her face radiant in its quiet pride. The pews were filled with the same townsfolk whose whispers had once scalded. Now they sat silent, watching as Derek lifted Deli's hand in his. There was no grand speech, no flourish, only the solemn joining of two souls who had endured rejection and fire together. The vows spoken were plain, yet they carried the weight of mountains. When the preacher's voice faded and Derek kissed Deli's brow, the hush in the room was deeper than applause, filled with a kind of reverence that could not be faked. Deli stood taller, her eyes shining, no longer the cast-off daughter of a cruel stepfather, but a wife, a woman claimed with pride. Derek, once hollowed by grief, felt the strength of life rush back into him like spring floodwaters. As they stepped outside, the sunlight broke through clouds, casting gold across the church steps. Derek held Deli's hand, and though no cheer rose, the silence of the crowd felt different now, less like judgment, more like witness. Dust lifted in the breeze, swirling around them as they walked together, not hidden, not ashamed. And later, when night fell and the cabin stood patched but whole, Derek sat by the fire with Deli beside him. Hattie slept curled in blankets. Martha hummed softly in her rocker. Derek felt the heat of the flames against his skin and the steady presence of the woman at his side. He knew then that loneliness had lost its grip on him. The world had changed in the space of one storm, one fire, one vow. Remember this, dear listener. Love is not always thunderous or adorned with riches. Sometimes it is found in the quiet moments, in the steady hand that reaches through smoke, in the courage of a woman who stands when the world would see her bowed. Sometimes love rides in on a weary mule, carrying shame and hunger, and still saves you as much as you save it. And if you open your door to it, you may find that even the loneliest mountain can bloom again. Now, there's another story waiting for you, wilder still, and it will stir something fierce and tender in your heart. Click it, and carry these lessons with you, for life is shorter than we know, and the next tale may just change the way you see your own.